Hello, my name is Rain and welcome to my channel where I discuss Fantasy Formula 1. Today we're going to discuss the Canadian Grand Prix, what happened in it, because a lot of things happened in the Canadian Grand Prix, and then we're going to discuss what my plans are going forward in, well, the European tour, the European part of the season. So, if that sounds interesting, stick around and we'll get right to it. I'm sure no one has missed what an absolute stinker, fantasy-wise, the Canadian Grand Prix was for the majority of us. Ferrari double DNF, Checo DNF, hurting Red Bull owners once again, double Williams DNF. I mean, the DNFs kept coming. You had Haas going on a tear in the beginning and then dropping back, missing out on massive scores. You had so many high budget increases, Mercedes doing great. You had Russell people, it just doesn't stop, alright? It just doesn't stop, and there's so many things we need to discuss, and I thought I would take the moment to discuss some of my decisions, predictions, and where it went wrong, but also where it went right. Because I think a very important thing about F1 fantasy and all fantasy sports in general is that you cannot judge a decision based on the outcome a lot of the time. You have to judge the decision based on, what you knew beforehand. You have to judge it on the decision and not on the outcome. And I feel like with F1 fantasy in particular, this is very, very true because you can never predict DNFs. You can look at a race that's rainy and say, I don't trust Logan Sargent, and therefore I will not pick Logan Sargent. And that is good decision making. But if you're stuck with Logan Sargent because that's the only driver you could afford and you really wanted to have something else and you thought that Mercedes were going to do really well, and Mercedes did do really well, you could still say that you were unlucky that Logan Sargent DNF'd. And the same goes for Ferrari. I said in my tier list video that I posted last week that Ferrari, the constructor, were the only essential asset in the game, and then they double DNF'd. That is unlucky. And I still think, despite that, and despite what happened in the Canadian Grand Prix, that Ferrari as a constructor is essential going forward. We don't really know what happened in Canada and why the Ferrari was slow, why the Ferrari was unreliable. I mean, the rain took Carlos out, but they had issues with the Leclerc. They didn't get to Q3. They had a pretty poor weekend, and it was saved by their pit stops, right? And I think this kind of shows why Ferrari is still good. They got minus 40 points for 2 DNFs, but they still came away with only negative 16 thanks to race overtakes and 2 fastest pit stop points. So with those fastest pit stop points, I think Ferrari are still going to be the best constructor asset going forward. They're still below 25 million. And, I mean, there's no way they double DNF again, right? So, I feel very confident and very happy owning Ferrari. And if I did not have Ferrari, if you were one of the lucky ones who were with McLaren and Mercedes in Canada, I would still look to buy Ferrari for Spain and Austria and Silverstone. So, Ferrari, very, very unlucky, and you could say that with many of your picks, and I'm gonna go through a couple of them, but I just want you to remember to not judge it on the outcome, judge it on the decision. Yeah, there's gonna be a few of those talks in today's video. So what happened then? I was on 70 points this weekend. It is by far my worst weekend this year. My worst weekend prior to this was Saudi with 168 points. Yeah, it's a pretty big drop off of nearly 100 points. Mainly due to the Charles Leclerc DNF. If only Sainz had DNF'd, the Charles Leclerc would have been fine. Ferrari, Charles were lost for a while, but that could have led to a lot of overtakes if they had stayed out on track and they hadn't DNF'd. They messed up the decision making. They messed up the strategy pretty badly. But I mean, Charles Leclerc from 19th could have gotten a lot of overtakes and still ended up on a decent point score. And I know a lot of you saw my video where I discussed should you final fix Russell in, and I mean, the decision to not final fix Russell in, I feel like was the correct decision, because looking at the race results, Russell only got 17 points in the race. I was predicting Hamilton and Leclerc to be at around 17 points. Now, Hamilton got a lot more points than that, but Hamilton got the fastest lap, and again, you cannot predict the fastest lap. So Hamilton without the fastest lap got 18 points, and that's exactly, like, that's just where I predicted Hamilton would be. That's around the points I predicted Leclerc to be as well. And Russell got less than that. Russell got 17. Russell did not get the driver of the day. He ended P3. He had a decent race, but he made some mistakes, which I do believe cost him at least second place, right? So Russell was not the correct decision to final fix in. But if you had Leclerc and you did final fix Russell in, it was worth it because Leclerc ended with negative 16 points and Russell ended with 17 points. But if Leclerc had not DNF'd, I think Leclerc would have outscored Russell even. So the decision to not final fix Russell in was correct, but it ended up being wrong. And, judge it by the decision and not by the outcome. The same spiel. What else happened? Thankfully, if we look at some budget here, Lance Stroll, Kevin, and Ocon all performed great. They all increased 1 million. Kevin Magnussen could have had a monster haul had Haas not messed up the pit stop. But all of them increasing 1 million. Yuki decreasing 0.2 is fine. He is still owned by 40% of people, which is extremely, extremely high. So him decreasing in price does not hurt that much. But if you remember from my deadline stream, and if you weren't there, you should definitely be there for the next one. In my deadline stream, I had two options. I was either going to go with Yuki Tsunoda, Lance Stroll, and McLaren out for Ocon, Lewis Hamilton, then with the DRS boost and Mercedes, or which was what I ended up going for, Bottas, Hülkenberg, and McLaren out for Magnussen, Ocon, and Mercedes. And the things I sold were correct. I sold McLaren for Mercedes, which ended up being correct. Mercedes outscored McLaren, and they increased more in price, so that was just a straight up upgrade. Obviously, I should have sold Ferrari for Mercedes, but I couldn't have known that. So that decision ended up being correct. And then the decision to sell Bottas and Hülkenberg, Bottas and Hülkenberg did great. They got a total of 27 points, which is fantastic. But Magnussen and Ocon got 30. So the decisions I made, the transfers that I made, ended up being a net positive. But the option I ended up not going with, the Hamilton route, would have been way, way, way better. Let me just show you quickly. This was essentially what I was deciding between. And if you don't get what this is, just look at the left side and the right side. So the difference between my two teams, between the transfer I would have made, would have been double Hamilton, Bottas, and Hülkenberg versus Leclerc, Tsunoda, Stroll, and Magnussen. So I ended up going with the right side because we did not trust Hamilton, and after qualifying it looked great. But the left side would have been a lot more points. Stroll and Magnussen did outperform Hülkenberg and Bottas by 3 points, but Leclerc DNF'd for negative 16 points, Yuki got 0 points, and Hamilton got a massive 28 haul, which would have been doubled. The reason there's two Hamiltons there is because I would have had the DRS boost on Hamilton. The reason why there's only one Leclerc on the right side is because, I still have Leclerc with the Hamilton team. I would have had just one of Leclerc. Meanwhile, in the other team, I would have had two. So this would have been the difference between the two routes I could have gone, and I ended up going for the wrong one. And that's kind of been the story of my team and my season so far in F1 Fantasy. So many times this year, and if you've been following me, you will feel like it feels like deja vu. So many times this season, I've made the correct decision, but it's been the wrong outcome between the two different options, if that makes sense. If I've had two different options to go for, I've always chosen the wrong one. And it's been down to a DNF or one C-tier driver, like when I sold Yuki Tsunoda before Australia, that Yuki popped off. So it's been an annoying season. Yeah, you can see I sold Yuki before his 11 and 10 pointer, where I had essentially a 50-50 of who to sell between Yuki and someone else. I can't even remember. There's been a lot of those decisions, a lot of those outcomes going against me this season so far. With that abysmal 70 pointer in Canada, I've decreased once again, but it was only a slight decrease in rank, down to 11,000. I think the fact that I had Stroll, Magnussen, and Ocon in there helped a lot, and also the fact that a lot of people were running Ferrari, so it wasn't as big of a loss as, you know, perhaps a double Haas would have been in Monaco. So overall, a dumpster fire of a weekend, but we move on. Let's check out what we should do for Spain. So whoever you are sitting out there, whoever you are sitting with in your teams, drivers, constructors, whether you have 2 or 3 free transfers, I still think the 2 sort of lineups that are meta right now are the single B and the double B lineup that I discussed in my transfer plans video for Canada. And if you don't know what the single B and double B lineup is, first you need to watch my team value video, which is pinned on my channel. I talk about it every single time I'm on this channel, so if you haven't watched that video, you really should, because I'm using the terminology from that video. You get it by this point. If you've been here before, I'm sorry that I keep mentioning it, but I think that video is so important to understand the terminology that I'm using in all of these videos. So no matter which lineup you are sitting with, the 2 lineups that I think we should all be focusing on is the single B or the double B lineup. And the double B lineup looked really, really strong before Canada. It was really, really powerful in Monaco. Will that continue to be strong? I don't know. But the difference between these 2 lineups is, you know, the value of C-tier assets you have. I think for constructors, you're still sitting on 2 premiums, whether you're sitting with Ferrari, Mercedes, Mercedes, McLaren, Red Bull, Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, whichever combination you go for. I think the way forward is with 2 premium constructors. You can be a bit of a silly goose and go for something like a Haas or something like a RB, but I don't think that's the correct play at all. I think that's just incorrect. I think for the Canadian Grand Prix, the single B lineup was probably stronger, because I suspect that a lot of people with the double B lineup is sitting with either Leclerc or Sainz, and obviously they DNF'd, but the difference between the single B and the double B lineup just, you know, ends up being DNFs at this point. If you have a double B lineup, you're more likely to sit with a Logan Sargeant. Logan Sargeant DNF'd, so therefore the double B lineup was worse. Most of the premium C-tier assets, bar like Yuki Tsunoda, performed really, really well and got big price hikes. So therefore, if you had the correct C-tier assets, the single B lineup performed better. So I actually don't think there's that much splitting the 2. I think you just have to make an evaluation based on your team. What sacrifices are you making to get that double B tier lineup in? Are you having a worse constructor for that race? It turns out now that Mercedes is in it. Maybe Mercedes is the way to go, and with Mercedes being cheaper than the McLaren and the Red Bull, maybe you can actually fit in a double B tier lineup easier. These are the kinds of things you have to take into consideration, and I love to answer your specific team questions when we get to the deadline stream the Saturday before the Saturday just before qualifying. For me personally, I now have 4.7 million in the bank. I only have 2 free transfers, and the main thing I'm looking up now that we get into Europe is Max Verstappen and Red Bull. How good are they going to be? Can Checo keep it out of the wall for once and, you know, actually bring Red Bull owners some points? Those are the sort of things I'm looking at. Whether I'm moving to a 2B lineup or sticking with a single B, it sort of depends. With the single B lineup, there's no real improvement I can make at this point apart from upgrading something like Mercedes. So I could sell Mercedes for McLaren if McLaren looked really, really strong. Norris could definitely have won in Canada. The problem with McLaren though is that a lot of the points from McLaren is through Norris, and Norris' just ability to get driver of the day points because he's so popular, and you don't get driver of the day points for the constructor. So in terms of McLaren, I actually just like Norris better because you can DRS boost Norris. So since McLaren is 25.6 million, I actually just kind of prefer Mercedes above them. I can't really stretch to a Red Bull no matter how I do. I would need to sell another asset. So if I really want Red Bull in, I could just sell something like a Lance Stroll, use 2 transfers, and I don't know, get something like a Daniel Ricciardo in or a Nico Hülkenberg, something like that, if I wanted Red Bull Racing in. And I could also do this for instead of the Mercedes. It doesn't have to be the Ferrari that goes. So I can do this, right? I like these options. They aren't bad. If I really, really want Red Bull, that is probably the route I will end up taking. It doesn't even have to be Lance Stroll leaving. It could be Yeah, I just use Lance Stroll because he's the most expensive one, and he usually takes up those kinds of slots. But say I want to, maybe I don't want Esteban Ocon now that he doesn't have a 5-place grid penalty. I might just do a Valtteri Bottas in, and I can just afford that. Valtteri Bottas has looked decent. He increased the price again. These are the kinds of changes that I can personally afford to make in my team. I actually kind of like them, but I'm also liking the Mercedes, and we don't know if the Mercedes is going to keep being good or if that was just a one-off in Canada. So again, we have to look at free practice, wait and see, all of that jazz. You know that by now. Don't make your transfers early. And I mean, the main reason why you shouldn't make your transfers early, look at Canada. Was any of us considering some of us were considering Mercedes the constructor. Was any one of you actually considering bringing in Hamilton or Russell before Canada? The answer is no. The answer is straight up no. I thought you were trolling if you were bringing them in when you could just bring in Piastri or Sainz or Leclerc, and now it turns out they were the best option all along. So maybe Mercedes are good now. We'll have to wait and see, but I suspect Red Bull will be strong in Europe. I mean, we've all expected this. The problem with Red Bull is Checo. I mean, Max is performing well, but Max is not popular. He's not getting Driver of the Day points. And he got less points than Norris, even though he both out-qualified Norris and outplaced Norris. Norris got more points. So this Driver of the Day points are so massive that I just prefer Norris over Verstappen for that reason. And I prefer the Red Bull over the McLaren because the Red Bull can get fastest pit stop points. But for the Red Bull to outscore the McLaren, you need Perez to stop crashing. And surely he will stop now. Like, there's no way. As for single B lineup, I talked about how I couldn't really improve it, and that's because I sort of think I have the best C-tier assets. The one thing is maybe Esteban Ocon. Now that Ocon is does not have a 5-place grid penalty, he might not be preferred. You could probably go for something like a Hulkenberg instead, and that could be the team. But then I'm leaving 6 million in the bank at this point, so at that point, why don't I just downgrade Ocon and go for an expensive asset? The problem with that, now switching to a double B tier lineup for me requires 3 transfers most of the time. So even if I go for the cheapest one of the good B tier drivers, which is George Russell, the only thing I can afford here is the Aston Martin, and I'm not really interested in that. I could justify getting a B tier driver by selling Stroll and Ocon, keeping Mercedes, and in that case I could actually get something in. Checo has another grid penalty after he drove back from crashing into the pit stop with an unsafe car. So Checo has a 3-place grid penalty in Spain, which could be good, but again, do I trust Checo right now? I don't think I do. With Checo though, the only thing I can afford is a Logan Sargent. Do I want to rely on Checo and Logan Sargent in this spot? I don't think so. Even if I go for something like Piastri, I still cannot afford Zhou Guanyu. You can't see the price here, but Zhou Guanyu is 7.9 million, and yeah, you can see I have 7.5 here, so I still need to go for Logan Sargent. So the only thing I could really afford in that second B tier lineup with 2 transfers is a George Russell. With George Russell, I could get anything from Albon down to Sargent. So I could go for a George Russell combined with Valtteri Bottas. Do I want to go for that? Maybe, if the Mercedes look good again. I mean, this is all that it depends on. As for Checo, let's just briefly talk about him. I could just switch to Checo. It's very scary to rely on Checo as your only DRS boosted driver. Could be something to go for sure if Red Bull look really, really strong and I want to get, utilize Checo's 3-place grid penalty. The problem with like a grid penalty for Checo compared to Ocon's grid penalty, which I pushed very hard for you to get Ocon in, and I was completely correct about that, by the way. Shout out to the Ocon gang in my deadline stream. The problem with Checo compared to Ocon is that Ocon with a 5-place grid penalty was starting last. I mean, after the stakes made some changes, he started P18. And that's where I was expecting him to start. As for Checo, if he has just a regular qualifying where he doesn't get eliminated in Q1, say he qualifies P5, I feel like that's reasonable. Checo should manage a P5. He qualifies P8. And are you that excited by Checo from P8? What does he have in front of him? Probably both Mercedes, both McLaren, both Ferraris, and Max. Will he pass them? I don't know. The Red Bull is looking like a difficult car to drive, and it looks like only Max Verstappen knows how it's done. So Checo from P8 is not as exciting as Esteban Ocon from P20. And that's just a fact. So I'm not sure I will go for Checo. I probably not. If you want to go for a wacky strategy and again be a bit of a silly goose, you can go for Checo. I don't think it's a bad option. I don't think it's a great option though, and I currently don't trust Checo at all, which is also why I'm not really considering the Red Bull switch yet. But I also want to get those Max Verstappen points, and I think if Checo can actually just get a P3, which he should be capable of getting, at that point the Red Bull constructor and the Red Bull assets are actually valuable, are actually good. But while Checo is this uncertainty, I don't think it's safe to go for him. I think you're better off sticking with the McLarens, the Ferraris, and the Mercedes. So with all of that said, what are my actual plans? And again, this season is so excited for us fantasy strategists because I don't know. I don't know what my plan is at this moment in time. If the Mercedes looks slow, I think it's just selling Mercedes to McLaren and taking an extra free transfer into Austria, because you have to keep that in mind too. The race after Spain is a sprint weekend, and you want to have the best team possible for the sprint weekend because it's in the sprints that you can get the points, right? So for a sprint weekend, I probably want to have 3 free transfers available. So with all of this double switching that I just talked about, I don't think it's very likely. I think I'm very likely to just make 1 transfer this weekend, and I think you should too. If you're sitting on three free transfers, I would even consider just using 2 of them. Even if you could use 3 free transfers to overhaul your team completely and switch strategies, I think you should look to save 1 free transfer for Austria. And I know we're talking about Austria here in the Spanish Grand Prix video, but I think it's important to mention, after the maths came out after the Miami Grand Prix done by F1 Fantasy Tools, that with all the limitless stuff, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can look at their Twitter, and I've talked about this on live streams, I've talked about this on previous videos, that using a limitless chip on a single weekend is better. If you still have your limitless chip, I would consider it for Austria, but I would wait until after qualifying to see if the B-tier drivers that you want, the B and A-tier drivers that you want for your team, are underperforming in qualifying. For us who aren't limitless, aren't going with the limitless, because C-tier and worse drivers, worse cars are better in sprint races because they can get more overtake points. Things like Kevin Magnussen, things like Ocon, things like Stroll, things like Yuki. Those drivers, because they are closer in the points that they get to the B and A tier drivers in sprint weekends, and the reason for this is because, again, Max Verstappen qualifying in P1 in the sprint gets, P1 in the sprint, he gets 8 points. That's it. Meanwhile, Magnussen starts P18, goes up to P14, gets 4 points for overtakes and 4 points for race positions gained, and has 8 points. That's the same as Max Verstappen. So this sprint race is a big risk because it brings the added risk of an extra DNF for your members. So no negative is a great option for all sprint races for this reason. And since C-tier drivers are more likely to DNF than A and B-tier drivers, it is a risk, but I do think with the correct C-tier drivers, a single B lineup could be the strongest in Austria in a sprint weekend. But this requires you to get the correct B-tier driver or A-tier driver, the correct DRS booster driver, and the correct C-tier drivers. DNFs will mess you up if your B-tier driver of choice, such as Charles Leclerc, gets a minus 16 points. You're not going to perform well. That's the safety of the double B lineup. With the double B lineup, you have 2 options. You can DRS boost one of them. You can even autopilot. And the safety of having those 2 B-tier drivers is valuable. But I think the ceiling is definitely higher with a single B lineup for Austria. So if you're like me and you're sitting on a team... Well, I'll just bring up my actual team. If you're sitting on a team like this with a single B-tier driver and the best C-tier drivers possible, I think you only make 1 transfer this weekend, or 2 if you have 3 free transfers. You save 1 free transfer, and then you go into Austria betting on those C-tier drivers to get the deal done, to not DNF, and to get you the points. Because the amount of the haul you can get, the amount of points you can sort of scratch in and climb against those running the double B lineup, I think it will be very, very strong in a sprint weekend. And overhauling your entire team now before Spain to then want to change back in Austria seems like a mistake to me. So if you're like me and you're sitting on the single B-tier lineup, I think you stick with it and just save transfers. If you're sitting on a 2 B-tier lineup, such as a Leclerc Piastri or similar, I think you also probably stick, but you keep your options open for the sprint race. I think for everyone this weekend, it's stick with one of those 2 strategies. Whichever one you are on, you stick with for Spain, and then you reassess in Austria and decide which one looks the best there. Save your transfers. This is not going to be as a big weekend as Canada in terms of transfers. I think you need to stay cool and actually save your transfers for Austria. Because those sprint weekends are so important for fantasy points. So with that said, what are my likely 1 free transfer moves? Again, if Mercedes look bad, I could just switch back to McLaren super easy. If Mercedes still look good and I want to build budget with Mercedes as an option, I could sell Ocon if I don't like the look of Ocon now, for essentially any C-tier driver of choice that I think is going to perform well. I think the options are either Daniel Ricciardo or Nico Hülkenberg. I think those are the 2 ones that I would be looking to switch Ocon to. Again, you can definitely stick with Ocon. I don't think Ocon is a bad pick, but I'm probably making 1 transfer. I'm not rolling this entire team. As for Charles Leclerc, that's the 3rd thing. If Ferrari still look bad, I'm probably sticking with the Ferrari constructor. I could end up switching Charles Leclerc. So if I keep Ocon here, I could end up going for Lando Norris. Now, Lando Norris is not a B-tier asset, he's an A-tier asset, so he doesn't increase as much in price. But with those driver of the days, if it's looking like he can win in Spain, which I definitely think is on the cards, I would love to have him. A Lando Norris 25-pointer for a win, plus his qualifying points, plus driver of the day, which he's definitely getting if he wins. That Lando Norris brings home a lot of points, so switching Leclerc to Norris looks pretty strong. And in terms of, Leclerc switches in 1 move, I think that's the only option. I wouldn't downgrade Leclerc to Hamilton, to Russell, to Sainz, to Piastri, to Checo with just 1 move. I would consider switching out Leclerc if I were to switch my lineup completely and go for a double B lineup with like Piastri, Hamilton. But that's not happening, right? I have to use just 1 free transfer here. So those are the 3 options I'm looking at. I don't know which I'm going for. I have to wait and see for free practice. But yeah, either Mercedes out for McLaren if Mercedes look bad. If Ferrari look bad, it could be Leclerc out for Norris. And if McLaren look good. And then if Ferrari look decent, Mercedes look decent, it looks impossible to tell, and I just want to make a transfer to make a transfer, it could be Ocon out to another driver if the Alpine drama looks to continue. So that about does it for this video. I know it's a not that many different talking points, just a lot of rambling about the same things. But I hope you still enjoyed it. There will be more videos coming out, at the beginning of next week. And then another deadline stream on Saturday before qualifying, 2 hours before qualifying for the Spanish Grand Prix. So join me then. It's great fun. We have fun memes like everyone should buy Esteban Ocon. It's just a great time. You should definitely be there. So mark your calendars 2 hours before qualifying on the next Saturday. Well, can't even remember the date. Be there. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye. Oh, and like and subscribe.